This video game caused outrage. The name Double Dragon 3 is steeped in controversy, with many gamers of today instantly pointing to the NES title with this name due to it not only being substandard in comparison to its predecessor, but also infamous with its meme-worthy Bimmy and Jimmy typo. However, the drama surrounding Double Dragon 3 doesn't stop just there. Oh, no. The biggest disappointments would revolve around the dreadful arcade game of the same name, which was not just a bad game, but an awful title that would pioneer a disgusting feature. A disappointing inclusion that I must add still continues to raise its ugly head in modern gaming experiences. I for one feel annoyed reminiscing about this sinister predatory practice right now. So with all of that said, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is why Double Dragon 3 caused outrage. Yeah! It is impossible to understate just what a significant role a Double Dragon played within the game industry. The first game, from 1987, developed by Yoshihisa Kishimoto of Technos Japan, ushered in many new elements into the realm of gaming. This title offered a fun experience like never before, allowing people to not only play a beat-em-up cooperatively for the first time, but also establishing a number of other major tropes in the genre too. Kishimoto by this point was already the godfather of beat-em-ups, and was building on his previous work established in Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun, a little title that is internationally known as Renegade. The following year in 1988 saw the release of Double Dragon 2, a sequel to the original that was initially intended to be just an upgrade. However, the game evolved so much during development it became a standalone title. The impressive Double Dragon 2 The Revenge, with its increased memory size, not only offered consumers new levels to experience, but also fixed many of the flaws the original game had. Most notably, it featured far less slowdown, making a playthrough far more fluid and even more enjoyable. New moves were added to the game too, giving players more control than ever. The success of Double Dragon 2 sent shockwaves through the industry, leading other developers to release beat-em-ups of their own, such as Capcom's Final Fight, Sega's Golden Axe, and Konami's Crime Fighters, all of which were made directly in response to Double Dragon 2. Essentially, without this game, we wouldn't have any of the fantastic titles that inspired it. After the success of the previous game, a third installment in the series was a no-brainer, with the first version of the game hitting arcades in 1990. It is said that development on this one started in the previous year of 1989. However, interestingly, the production of this one was not led by the legendary Kishimoto like its predecessors, which raises the question, why? Well, to put it simply, he was already tied up working on other projects for Technos. These projects included another game that would go down in history as an all-time great, WWF Superstars. The first amazing WWF game developed for the American World Wrestling Federation would be achieved in Japan. The game is a true gem, and the influence that Double Dragon had on its design and mechanics is easy to see. Building on his arcade legacy, that year Kishimoto also worked on a new intellectual property, a game known as The Combat Tribes. The Combat Tribes was a high-quality, 3-player beat-em-up that once again shared a lot of similarities with Kishimoto's previous work. For this reason, many people look at this game as the spiritual Double Dragon 3, which makes a lot of sense considering it is a game from the same genre, produced by the same development house, and led by the same creator. However, as interesting as all of this is unfortunately not the game we are focusing on today. Instead, we need to look at the official Double Dragon 3, or should I say threes, but more on that soon. Going back to gaming's distant past, through this period, Kishimoto was busy building these iconic games. This meant that Technos Japan would choose to outsource the production of the third Double Dragon game to a company known as East Technology, a fairly new development house of the time that had created arcade games previously such as Destruction and Gigandes. The fact that Kishimoto had little to do with this game, and the fact that Technos didn't bother to make the third entry in a beloved series themselves, is a massive red flag if I've ever seen one. This means that it's not surprising really that the end product would be the creation of a game with drastically different gameplay and graphics from its predecessors. To extract some positives from all of this, in a step up from the other games in the series like The Combat Tribes, this game does boast 3-player cooperative play, meaning players could not just take control of both Bimmy and Jimmy Lee, but also a yellow-wearing new character named Sunny. In this game's plot, the brothers return home after a 2-year training mission and stumble across a fortune teller known as Hiroko, who informs them they need to seek out 3 Rosetta Stones scattered across the planet to become the world's strongest fighters. The adventure begins in the USA with the brothers taking on the remnants of the Black Warriors gang before heading off to China, Japan, Italy and Egypt, fighting opponents around the world. The most interesting aspect of all of this, both then and now in my opinion, was certainly the introduction of Sonny. Sadly though, with regards to his inclusion, who he was left kind of ambiguous, as he was given no official backstory, making it unclear at this point in time if he was the third lead brother to be sure, or just their fellow Susetsuken practitioner. Despite disappearing from the scene for decades after this disaster, in more recent times he has re-emerged, showing up in Double Dragon 4, the River City Girls games, and most prominently of all as free DLC in Double Dragon Gaiden. At times he has been referenced as the third Lee brother, but it would be not until the amazing Double Dragon Gaiden that his background would be fully fleshed out, receiving his own unconventional signature fighting style. Billy and Jimmy's cousin has become a comic relief component in the series, and is essentially its equivalent to Dan Hibiki. A hilarious legacy for a backstoryless loser from one of the worst Double Dragon games of all time. Love it. Speaking of the epic Double Dragon Gaiden, I can get you 60% discount on this amazing game, as well as mega discounts on thousands of other titles, including all the big modern beat 'em ups, simply by using my instant gaming affiliate link. Support the channel and grab dozens of gaming bargains right now by just hitting that. Happy shopping. Back on the subject of the infamous Double Dragon 3 arcade game, like previously, combat is engaged with the use of a traditional 8-way directional joystick, accompanied by 3 action buttons, but the controls are greatly different from before, and not for the better. Directional attacks using the joystick and button combinations established in the fantastic Double Dragon 2 have been completely discarded, with this entry returning to a control scheme similar in many ways to the more primitive 1987 original. Despite its flaws, players do have some new abilities, such as being able to run by pushing twice on the joystick, or performing German suplexes, knee drops and running headbutts. Back-to-back hurricane kicks can now also be executed when 2 players perform the move standing near each other, so some nice little additions amongst this overall trash heap. Speaking of redeeming elements, another nice touch is that this one actually has further playable characters beyond Billy, Jimmy and Sonny, who we will touch more on briefly when discussing the NES game. As mentioned earlier, the game involves fighting around the world. Players start off in the USA in what appears to be New York City. I would say the backgrounds and foregrounds in this game are more detailed than what we had seen in the series before, but in my opinion at least, lacks the charm of what came before it. The game's sprite animations are ugly and lack detail, which is distracting considering Double Dragon 3 is a fairly aesthetically decent looking world to play in. They all look really out of place. To make matters worse, the characters' walking animations are dreadful, with so few frames that it looks like much of the action is happening in slow motion. What a sorry state of affairs. The combat too seems to be missing a lot of animations, making it look pretty terrible, especially whenever one player vaults over another. It's all very choppy. Instantaneously, from this first stage alone, you can see that this game is a lot more flawed than Double Dragon 2, despite the game's more polished backgrounds. The opening stage drags players through the uninspired streets of New York, where the dull brawls culminate in a lackluster boss fight in a warehouse. A cliched beat-em-up scenario. Things don't improve as players move on to China, fighting their way through a monotonous forest filled with poorly animated sprites, ending with a tiresome battle against a generic Bruce Lee knockoff. In Japan, the game falls back on tired tropes, pitting players against samurai sword-wielding foes in bland settings. The stage concludes with a repetitive and frustrating fight against a ninja who can replicate himself, adding more annoyance than challenge. Moving on, the game takes a bizarre and baffling turn in Italy, where players inexplicably face enemies that look like they're from ancient Rome rather than modern Italy. This disjointed stage is likely a result of the Rosetta Stone's magic, but feels more like a hasty Golden Axe ripoff than a coherent part of Double Dragon. If you can still handle more of this tripe past this point, the action then trudges to Egypt, predictably setting players against enemies outside the pyramid. Magic inexplicably transports them to an underground forest, battling headless opponents to grating, trippy music. The supernatural elements feel tacked on as players slog through a pharaoh's tomb, facing generic ghouls that evoke a poor imitation of Splatterhouse. In yet another low point, you take part in the final boss fight against the mummified remains of Cleopatra, who awkwardly rises from her grave. After a tedious battle, she regenerates into a flying, magic-wielding version of herself. This underwhelming climax ends with the brothers finding her treasure and absurdly promising to donate it to charity, raising serious questions about their rights to do so. Let's keep in mind that this game came out in 1990, so if they did donate Cleopatra's treasure, they would have been extradited to Egypt to face legal consequences for their reckless actions, a fittingly bad conclusion to a disappointing game. So that was pretty much what Double Dragon 3 in the arcades offered in a nutshell. Choppy combat animations with missing frames, uninspiring gameplay, ugly graphics and a nonsensical story. But as amusing as all of this is to poke fun at, let's dig into what you are really here for. Discussing the predatory crap which was included that would really rub gamers the wrong way. The game's most infamous and downright deplorable feature was the inclusion of an item shop, accessible at the start of certain stages. In this shop, players could purchase power-ups, faster attack speeds, new moves, health, weapons, and even additional playable characters. But here's the kicker. To unlock these extras, players had to use real-world money, which they needed to insert into the cabinet. This in-game store was a blatant cash grab, a shocking first in gaming history that introduced microtransactions to unlock additional content. Even worse, it pioneered the appalling pay-to-win mechanic, where players who shelled out more cash could make their characters significantly more powerful. The game was cynically designed to squeeze as much money as possible from arcade consumers in new and exploitative ways. Double Dragon 3's shameless greed outstripped even the most pioneering aspects of its predecessors. This despicable feature outraged players, resulting in a storm of backlash. The controversy was so intense that the Japanese version of the game, released after the North American and European versions, had to completely remove this disgraceful mechanic. Double Dragon 3 will forever be remembered not for its gameplay, but for its audacious attempt to fleece players, earning it a notorious place in the annals of gaming history. The concept of a pay-to-win mechanic and microtransactions after you had already paid to play a game was an outrageous insult to gamers, and it laid bare the blatant greed of these corporate gaming vultures. The brazen exploitation was so transparent that gamers across the West were infuriated, leading to a complete shunning of the game. Technos and East Technology, in a desperate attempt to salvage their reputation, tried to do better in Japan, but the damage was already done. Double Dragon 3 in the arcade stands as one of the most shameless and greedy cash grabs in the entire history of gaming, unrivaled in its audacity at the time of its release. The situation becomes even more sordid when you realise that the original developers who crafted the first two beloved games were sidelined, likely because Technos aimed to milk the established Double Dragon name without investing in any quality. Corners were cut at every turn, resulting in a game that not only betrayed its loyal fanbase, but also severely tarnished the Double Dragon brand. This travesty did irreparable harm, and its legacy is a stark reminder of corporate greed at its absolute worst. What was wrong with Double Dragon 3 in 1990 is everything that is wrong with the predatory gaming landscape today. While this marked a dark chapter in gaming history, the Double Dragon 3 story didn't quite end there, as arguably Double Dragon's legacy on home consoles is as important, if not more important, than even in the arcades. Funnily enough, the well-known NES Double Dragon 3 would not be an arcade conversion but a different title completely, so let's visit that side of things. After Double Dragon 3, the Rosetta Stones, which we just looked at, we got the Sacred Stones on the NES, with the two different subheadings helping to differentiate these two distinctively different games. This other Double Dragon 3 game was developed simultaneously with the arcade game, so that they could be released within a similar time frame. In many ways, this made sense as the NES platform had become increasingly important, becoming a huge hit in both the United States and Japan. Traditionally, Technos had released Double Dragon arcade games, then later released highly altered ports suitable for the NES home market. So in a way, it made a lot of sense to make a separate game from scratch, bespoke for the home experience. The rise of a home console market paired with a diminishing arcade industry over time might explain why Technos got greedy in the arcades too. It draws parallels with development costs going up in gaming today, with publishers looking to nickel and dime consumers through predatory practices instead. We have to remember what a poor spot the arcade industry was in 1990. This was a particular low, as we were still a year away from Street Fighter 2 and the versus fighting gaming genre rejuvenating that market. Fortunately, unlike the abysmal arcade game, more legitimate resources would be pumped into the NES game, including the title being developed by Technos themselves, meaning it looks aesthetically faithful to its fellow NES Trilogy members. The game features two key modes labelled A and B. Mode A doesn't allow for friendly fire, while Mode B does, perfect for those sibling rivalries during a playthrough. Strangely, the NES version, like its arcade counterpart, regressed significantly from its predecessor. This installment offered more basic controls than what players had experienced in Double Dragon 2 on the same platform. However, one notable addition was the ability to dash with a double tap of the D-pad, accompanied by a few extra moves. This suggests there might have been some level of communication between the two development teams working on both versions of Double Dragon 3, despite their many notable differences. In a bizarre twist, the NES version picks up after the downfall of the Shadow Warriors, with Marion alive here, even though she's dead in the arcade game storyline. It's funny how the NES games were so conservative in their storytelling in comparison to what could be experienced elsewhere. Good old Nintendo were the Sony PlayStation brand of their day. They loved heavy-handed censorship. Once again, she's kidnapped by a mysterious organisation because apparently the plot needed recycling. The brothers, as if on autopilot, meet the fortune teller Hiroko yet again. She conveniently informs them that Marion's kidnappers are now after 3 sacred stones of power scattered around the globe. Naturally, the only way to rescue her is to find these stones first. This contrived setup sends the brothers on a redundant world tour, fighting in the same countries as in the arcade game. This time though, their quest is not to challenge the world's most powerful fighters, but to save Marion. Again! The story feels like a poor attempt at continuity, dealt with recycled plot points and nonsensical changes. It's also noteworthy that many of the playable characters from the arcade game return too. However, rather than being unlocked through microtransactions or being instantly playable at the start of the game, this time they must be unlocked through other means. An awesome feature that mirrors the amazing modern Double Dragon Gaiden video game. A lot better than more predatory modern games like Mortal Kombat 1 or Street Fighter 6, where you must pay to unlock new characters. Yuck. We are certainly treated worse as consumers now overall than back then usually. To unlock extra characters in this one, they first appear as enemy bosses, but once defeated, they become added to your party. By pressing the select button at any point, you can access a character selection screen and switch between any of the available fighters to add a splash of variety to a playthrough. Every character has their own unique fighting techniques, health points and speed, making them suitable for different situations. They each have their own backup weapons too, which can be drawn at any time from the selection screen. When one of your fighters dies within a stage, they are automatically switched out for another fighter. However, the game ends if a whole party is defeated. Apart from all of these changes, the game looks and feels a lot more like a Double Dragon game than the Double Dragon 3 game that appeared in the arcades, which I guess would not come as a surprise considering this one was produced by Technos themselves. This is basically a challenging beat-em-up game with a sprinkling of platforming elements here and there, allowing players additional opportunities to die if they are unfortunate enough to misstep or mistime a jump. The game was unremarkable for its time, but in my opinion nothing was overly offensively awful about this one. It just did not do enough in its day to stand out. We have to remember that by the time this game was released in 1991, far more impressive beat-em-ups could be played at home, such as Final Fight, Golden Axe and even Streets of Rage. The game was a bit of an instant dinosaur on release when you compare it to games available on better hardware. While the arcade game caused outrage due to its dreadful microtransaction system, the home version of Double Dragon 3 was less complained about in 1991. However, despite its mediocrity, Double Dragon 3 did manage to stir up quite a bit of reaction, mostly in the form of hilarious laughter. When people mention Double Dragon 3 today, the first thing that comes to mind is the infamous misspelling of Billy's name as Bimmy. Yes, while his name is spelled correctly throughout most of the game, the 2-player mode amusingly botches it right from the start. This legendary typo is perhaps the most memorable moment in an otherwise unremarkable entry. As for why this nonsense came to be, the hilarity of Bimmy is often attributed to the game's English script being drastically altered from its Japanese counterpart, making localization a bit of a challenge. For instance, in the Japanese version, Marion isn't even mentioned. Instead, the brothers are on a quest to become the world's strongest fighters, leading to a different final boss encounter altogether. And this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to differences. The Japanese version is also notably easier than its Western counterpart too. History shows us that the Bimmy blunder didn't just fade into obscurity, far from it. It's remembered in the form of memes, and mocked in online shows such as the Angry Video Game Nerd. Years later, the Double Dragon series decided to have some fun with it themselves in Double Dragon Neon. Here, mutated versions of the Lee brothers appear as enemies named Bimmy and Jammy, complete with a tagline for mistranslated mutants. It seems even Double Dragon couldn't resist poking fun at itself, turning a notorious mistake into an enduring joke. In fact, to illustrate that this incident still remains a relevant joke, Billy and Jimmy have recently been announced as DLC characters set to arrive in River City Girls 2. But previously, on April Fool's Day, the team had revealed Bimmy and Jammy instead. Let's never forget this legendary mistake. While we have covered the big two Double Dragon 3s that everyone knows about, Double Dragon 3 would also go on to appear on many other hardware platforms, but all of the other home versions of the game appeared to be ports of the arcade game rather than the NES one. The game would end up appearing across various micro and home computer formats that were popular in Europe, and in terms of systems that sold well on a more global scale, the game would appear on the Mega Drive, with the Game Boy version of the title existing though as yet another completely different game sharing the same name. Sprite work in the Game Boy version looks notably similar to what can be found in the NES game, and amusingly, the in-game store even makes a return. Fortunately, microtransactions aren't here though. This time, items can be purchased using coins dropped by enemy sprites, which is much better on the pockets. Speaking of this function, it is also present in the Mega Drive version of the game, a title which I must comment has much smoother animation than what is present in the arcade original. However, this game would not arrive on the hardware until 1993. So despite its improvements, it was not a particularly good looking beat 'em up for the system's current standards. Place it side by side with Streets of Rage 2 and there is a very clear winner. Across the board, the home versions of Double Dragon 3 were viewed by Technos as huge commercial failures. Nothing really seemed to go to plan with the project. In fact, when it comes to the NES version of the game, the very version they put the most time, money and effort into creating, the game sold so badly that it left their American publishers Acclaim with over 500,000 unsold copies of the title. The arcade game will go down in history as the first to try to rip off consumers with microtransactions, and the NES version will be remembered for, well, Bimmy. So at least there was that silver lining to the cloud in this tale. But as great as the introduction as Bimmy was, and even sunny to some degree, we can never forgive the despicable precedent set by Double Dragon 3's pay-to-win mechanics and shameless transactions. This appalling cash grab opened the floodgates for the rampant greed we see today, where games are designed not for enjoyment, but to gouge players at every turn. Loot boxes, in-game purchases, and endless monetization schemes arguably trace their vile origins back to this disaster. Double Dragon 3's audacity tried to normalise the idea that players should be milked dry for every cent, a thought track that continues to fundamentally corrupt the industry. Now, instead of focusing on crafting immersive and enjoyable experiences, some developers and publishers alike are laser focused on their bottom lines, treating gamers as mere cash cows. This toxic legacy has degraded the integrity of gaming, transforming what should be a creative and entertaining medium into a cesspool of corporate scummery. Most games are a rip-off now, which is why I would like to remind you that you can use my affiliate link to receive up to 90% off multiple AAA titles. Happy shopping! Cheerio!